As young photojournalists try to climb the career ladder and trying harder than ever to become established, they may find themselves taking extraordinary risks, going to not just a war zone, but perhaps the most dangerous part of that war zone. Today I'm talking to someone who arguably knows more about working in war zones than almost anyone. Former BBC producer Oggy Boytchev has been to war zones countless times, preparing the way for his world affairs editor John Simpson. Is he concerned about the growing number of freelancers heading straight into conflict zones without taking the realities on board, Oggy?
Yes, it's been a growing concern. Ever since the war in the Balkans, in Bosnia, this has become a big problem. This is partly due to something else. It's driven by the demand from various news channels and television stations. As a result of the democratization and the opening up of the media market, the market has increased in size, hence the demand for reports from war zones and hostile environments has increased because, let's face it, stories from hostile environments sell. This is not a new phenomenon. Newspapers in the old days, before television, have always prided themselves on sending reporters to war zones, sometimes in rather comic situations when people totally unprepared would go to a war zone and expose themselves to numerous risks. The most recent example of freelancers getting killed in a war zone was Libya. The demand for coverage from Libya was so great that lots of people just jumped on a plane, went to Benghazi, then made their way down to Misrata, where some of the most fierce fighting took place, and exposed themselves to enormous danger without even thinking. They thought, oh well, it's a managed situation. Whereas there was no, at that time when the war went in, the civil war had just started, NATO was preparing its airstrikes, and people ended up in situations in Misrata when they were trapped. And they were all freelancers because most of the big news organizations, having assessed the risk, didn't send their crews there. It was open to freelancers, and this is the cynical situation these days, that big news organizations will not invest in sending their own crews to a unsafe situation, but they will take their reports and pay them piecemeal, piece by piece, which has raised all sorts of ethical questions. People who ended up in Misrata didn't have flak jackets, didn't have any hostile environment training, and they were doing news reports on the telephone to most of the big news organizations, and they got paid for it. So exposing oneself to risk is not a new phenomenon. What has happened in recent times, because travel has been made easy, you can just jump on a plane and go anywhere in the world, people think, oh well, I can just take a risk, go and see what happens. Hence my first point about going into a war zone or hostile environment is have a plan. You always have to have a plan. There are two types of people who do this work. The cautious type, who always exaggerate the risk in their own heads and are overcautious in planning it, and sometimes they back out of a situation. And the other type is the people who minimize the risk in their heads, and they just go and say, we'll just hope for the best. I myself fall in the first category. I always plan for the worst. And you hope that you don't reach this situation when you're faced with the worst possible scenario. And the worst possible scenario is to get killed. You have to decide in your head, is the story worth the risk? Am I doing humanity a big favor by reporting from a hostile environment with the risk of getting killed? Or am I doing it to sort of for self-glorification? And that is the worst possible scenario, when you go, take the risk, hoping that that will enhance your career. And in most cases, when people get hurt or killed, is when people go unprepared. They haven't planned for the exit. That is the main point in your planning preparations. What is your exit strategy? You always have to have an exit strategy. You just don't go in a situation when you're surrounded by hostile troops from all places and you haven't got a clue how you get out. Exit strategy is the first point when you plan something in your head. If it comes to the worst, how do you get out? Second point, when you go to foreign parts, is how do I find people who know the area? Working with local population, people who speak English or speak your own language if you're not English, and are able to help you navigate the dangerous landscape of the environment. That's why I say to people, it's impossible to work in a hostile environment without local help. Forget about being very brave, being very experienced, knowing how to do it. Even the most experienced war reporters will never work on their own. They will have to have local support. And by local support, I mean you've got to have reliable drivers. Number one, reliable driver who you can trust. How do you find that? Very difficult. Secondly, driver who is prepared to take you to the front line or to the dangerous situation. Not many people will be prepared to risk their lives and take you to a place where they can't get out. Secondly, the so-called fixer. Mr. Fix-It in a war zone is of paramount importance. This was first highlighted during the Bosnian War, the siege of Sarajevo, where foreign reporters were unable to do anything. They would be confined to their hotels without being able to do anything without Mr. Fix-It. And Mr. Fix-It is normally a local wheeler dealer, normally a person with not very savory background, but for a pay, for some money into his hand, he or she, very rarely, it's mostly Mr. Fix-It, will be prepared to help you. They will be prepared to put you in touch with the right people to interview. They will be prepared to take you to the right places where from a safe distance you can film what's unfolding in front of you. And they will be prepared to get you out of a dangerous situation. How do you find Mr. Fix-It? Well, that's the crucial part. And this is why reporters and producers with long experience in war zones have the edge over the young people who start in this business, because they've been around, they've been to the same area many times before. They know people, they know who will be prepared to help them, they know who will be prepared to take the risk, and they know whether it's worth doing it. This is the coming back to my first point. Before you start any plans, you have to assess whether it's worth risking your life for getting the story. If you feel that the story is not big enough to risk your life for it, don't do it. Don't do it, and no one will blame you for that, because it's the most natural thing in the world. I mean, I've seen experienced reporters who will say, I'm sorry, I'm not going there. It's too dangerous for what I can get.
But I think it's fair to say that those reporters like you, fixers like you, producers like you, are getting a salary. And those people who are in there to make a quick buck as fast as they can are prepared to take all kinds of risks, including not wearing a flak jacket, which they can't afford, because for them, if they don't take the risks, they don't get the action.
Well, that's the big dilemma for anybody who is not employed by a big news organization. This is why crews from big news organizations have the edge in this. However, having said that, there is a space for freelancers. There is a space for people who can go surreptitiously without too much fanfare, people who can slip in and out of dangerous zones with the help of local people. They will be inevitably on their own, which will be easier to do. But that's not the norm. The norm is when a big story happens, like Syria at the moment, which is a prime example of a vicious civil war, vicious sectarian war. If you're a freelancer, you're exposed to enormous danger compared with a crew from a big news organization, which was able to send you to a hostile environments course, who are able to send a security advisor with you, normally a former SAS person who knows how to navigate these landscapes, who knows what you need in these situations. For example, people underestimate how important it is to plan for the basic necessities: food, water, petrol. Getting from A to B. How do you get from A to B? Do you walk? Do you take a drive with somebody, which exposes you to danger of being spotted on the road and being fired upon or whatever? However, having said all that, in favor of the big news organizations who've got the financial muscle to arrange all this, there is space for freelancers to do their job, providing they know what they're doing. And the main thing for me, because I've never worked as a freelancer in these situations, but I've seen people doing it, they inevitably, photographers, video journalists, very few wire journalists, people who do written reports and all that. But they inevitably people with good local connections, people who know the area, people who know people in the area, people who speak the language, they can blend in and do their job properly. If you're just somebody who, even not a trained journalist, which I've seen happening in the world, somebody who suddenly decides, oh well, I'll go to Afghanistan. And there are admirable examples of people who train themselves on the job, so to speak. Incredibly brave people, reckless, because I understand that even for people like me and Simpson, to do the job that you do, you need a degree of recklessness, because you can never plan for everything that will unfold in a hostile situation. You can never plan. You can do your best. You can plan for your exit strategy. You can plan for your personal safety. Like if you go to Syria now, with all the talk of chemical weapons and all that, I would never dream of going there without a chemical and biological kit, which involves a gas mask, atropine injections in case you find yourself in a situation when help is not at hand and you have to survive for 12 to 24 hours before they get you to a hospital. You've got to administer these unpleasant things to yourself, which is very difficult for a freelance to get because they cost money.
So I can imagine you and John Simpson being together in Misrata in Libya and seeing for the first time this influx of freelancers. What did you say to each other about them, and what did you observe about their mistakes?
Well, it's very difficult to criticize people who risk their lives for doing. I have to start from the premise that by that I mean journalists, we work in a very competitive environment. And although there is a certain degree of camaraderie when you are in a war zone or hostile environment, there is a great degree of competition between the participants in the coverage of the story. So in the same way as any freelancer will see Simpson as the big competition if he turns up on a particular patch, in the same way we see these incredibly brave freelancers as the competition. If you're totally dispassionate about that, you will say they're incredibly brave, they're doing incredibly brave things, almost bordering on stupidity, but well done if they get the story. However, got to come back to the Misrata situation, 3 people got killed in Misrata because they ended up on their own. They ended up with the rebels, surrounded by Gaddafi loyalists, with no escape. It was a very claustrophobic situation, being pounded from all sides by Gaddafi loyalists. And even if you wanted to get out, you couldn't. So how would you plan for a situation like this? Very difficult to say, because you may enter a war zone or a hostile environment when it's open, at least on one side, and you can come and go from one side. But that changes. To give you an example, back in 2003, in the run-up to the Iraq War, the invasion of the Western troops of Iraq, Simpson and I were in northern Iraq. There was only one entry point, the Kurdish-controlled area of northern Iraq. There was only one entry point, and that was Turkey. It was open for a short period of time, and if I have to be honest, that short period of time was literally one day, when the Turks opened the border for some peace conference held by the Kurds in Erbil, in their capital. And dozens of journalists used that opportunity to get into northern Iraq, knowing that that window will close and there will be no way out. The Iran border on the east was closed unless you're prepared to take a very perilous journey through the mountains. The Syrian border to the west was closed because the Syrians didn't like anybody crossing the border apart from anybody approved by them. And on the south, to the south, was Baghdad. So how do you get out? We had to sit it out. We thought our only hope of getting out would be if Baghdad fell, which it did, and we made our way south through Mosul, Tikrit, Saddam's birthplace, into Baghdad. But you can never plan for these situations, because this could have dragged on for months. If it's a Syrian situation, it's dragging on for 2 years.
And in fact, John Simpson's march into Baghdad was quite extraordinary.
Well, there is a lot of... it wasn't just John Simpson. Because there were dozens of journalists holed up in northern Iraq with not very much to report. The instinct, everybody's instinct, was try to get as close as possible to Saddam Hussein's positions, or break through them and go into no man's land and start reporting something which is newsworthy. This is why so many journalists died in northern Iraq. More journalists died in northern Iraq, which was not on the front line, than people traveling with the American and the British troops from the south. So it's glamorous, and I can understand that there is a certain degree of glamorizing war reporting. It's glamorized not because of the people who do it, but of the people who consume the products. and by that I mean the general population, and by that I mean the news channels which offer this material. I mean, bizarrely, the bombing of Simpson's convoy in northern Iraq provided the biggest story of the war, which was not relevant to what was going on. It was a friendly fire situation.
So talk to me about a person going into a war zone for the first time. First of all, before they leave home, what should they think about? What should they put in their backpack? What should they expect to happen?
A person going to a war zone for the first time, my first advice to that person was don't go on your own. Try to find a way to go with either other like-minded people and form a group, a cooperative, if you like, or attach yourself to a big network. If you have something to offer, if you can operate a camera, if you can write, if you can take pictures, you can offer your services to a bigger crew and say, well, can I attach myself to you? I can provide certain services to you, but my first loyalty will be to the network or the newspaper or whoever buys your product in the first place. And that would work. That gives you a degree of security. I mean, again, coming back to the Iraq War in 2003, without naming names, there were two people, diverse backgrounds, diverse nationalities, who attached themselves to our crew simply by offering something to us. One of them spoke the local languages. The other one was a very good cameraman. Both freelancers, both on their own. And by attaching themselves to us, that meant that they had a degree of security which is provided by the fact that we were getting more information directly fed to us through London. And our editors in London were in constant contact with the MOD, with the Americans. We were getting advice where to go and where not to go. I mean, again, that's not a definitive answer to your predicament, getting advice from London, but at least you have a degree of security. Also, we had extra chemical and biological kits, we had extra flak jackets. It gave these freelancers the degree of security. One of them was actually injured during the friendly fire incident. So if there is one piece of advice I can give to a young aspiring journalist or photographer who wants to go into a war zone, don't go on your own.
Now, what should they put in their
backpack? Good question.
There's a photographer there and he's got his kit, which is quite heavy enough as it is. What else should he put in his kit?
Well, if you go into a war zone, and by that I mean not just a conventional war situation when you have a front line with two sides fighting each other, because inevitably you will go to one of the sides. You can't go in no man's land in the middle. Practical things. If you can get hold of a flak jacket, which is very expensive, take one. Don't worry about how heavy it is and all that. It's well worth it. It can save your life. And I've seen people moaning about taking flak jackets, wearing them, wearing helmets because it's heavy in a hot environment, it's sweaty and it's difficult to operate your camera. It's all round difficulties wearing a flak jacket, but it saves lives. Only example I can give you, Simpson still keeps at home a flak jacket with a big piece of shrapnel, big piece of sharp metal embedded in it, in the back of it, which saved his life. If he hadn't worn the flak jackets, he would have been dead. So a flak jacket, I know it's difficult for a freelancer to procure a flak jacket, but if you attach yourself to a bigger news organizations, maybe they can provide one for you. Secondly, normal things. A compass, a map, vitamin tablets, painkillers. If you go into a situation where one of the sites might use a chemical or biological weapon, you've got to have, like we were given, atropine injections, which luckily we didn't use in 2003. Apart from taking stuff in your backpack, you need to think what kind of vaccinations, jabs you can have. Big news corporations, again, organize that for their employees. You need to, sometimes in this situation, you need to drink water, which is not really clean. You can eat food which doesn't meet our standards of hygiene. And you've got to be prepared for these situations with medication. I would advise anybody who goes into a hostile environment to have a full vaccination, in which I include hepatitis A, hepatitis B, TB, cholera, everything that you can expect from a confined, unhygienic situation. So it's not so much what you take in your bag, but what you take with you in terms of preparation. When you go into the war zone, the main thing is you have to think about when you go on a filming trip or somewhere outside your comfort zone of the hotel or the camp or whatever. It's water and some basic food. I have seen people who are gasping for a bit of water because they've forgotten to take any with them. And by that I mean drinkable water, because there's always water around you, but you can't take the risk of drinking it. Then you have to take appropriate clothes. If you go into a hot environment, you've got to make sure, or environment where the sun is still strong, you've got to make sure you take light clothing, but inevitably clothing which covers the whole of your body. You've got to take a hat, because there's no point in going somewhere and then suffering severe burns from the sun, which takes you out of circulation. Talking of that situation about protecting yourself from the sun, don't assume that when you go there will be somewhere to buy sunblock or that sort of thing. You've got to think about everything that the particular geographic environment requires you to do. Think of it as going on a holiday. If I'm going on holiday in the jungle, what kind of kit do I need to take with me? If I go on a holiday to the desert, what kind of kit I need to take with me? I mean, it's common sense, in addition to the dangers of the war situation. There are the dangers of the physical environment.
I think it's fair to say that not all freelancers can attach themselves to large organisations, and there may be people who believe that the best way to finding a good job is to do a good job as a freelancer in the first place, and to come back with plenty of action in their cameras. What advice would you give to people? Because we know people are going to do that. What advice would you give to them in terms of risk taking?
Well, it's very difficult to give advice to somebody who is determined to do something, and I can understand what you're saying about young, ambitious reporters or photographers who want to make a name for themselves, and inevitably they will take the risk. Well, the basic advice will be, I guess, use your common sense. There is nothing I can advise you which will take into account all the intricacies of individual situation. I know people who've done that. I know people who've been out on their own. People who have taken bigger risks than journalists working for big organizations. It is very difficult. It's one of these intractable situations. It's just like the chicken and egg situation. If you're a young journalist, you've got to prove yourself. In order to prove yourself, you've got to do something. You've got to take inordinate risk. You've got to take bigger risk than the rest of us. And again, it comes back to my first point. Do your homework. Plan in advance. Research the geographic area, research the political situation, have a plan B, and plan B is the exit strategy. What do I do if I'm suddenly trapped? Or how do I avoid getting myself in a situation when I'm trapped? And don't forget, when you get into a big story, like Syria or Libya, when you go into the entry points of these war zones, like Benghazi was because it was held by the rebels in Libya, or like several points on the Turkish border now on the Syrian story, you will see lots of people like you. You will see other people. You talk to them, find out where they're going, what they're doing. Don't rush straight away. Take a few days to research the situation, find somebody who can help you with local knowledge. But that's the other thing for a young aspiring journalist. You've got to take money with you. Don't think that you can just manage on your own. You've got to take money, you've got to research what is the currency the local people accept. There were ridiculous situations in Iraq, for example, when they wouldn't take $100 notes because the chances of getting fake $100 notes were higher than getting smaller denominations. So that sort of thing. There are situations when people don't want dollars, they want euros, they don't like euros, they take pounds. And if you end up with a wallet full of credit cards, that's not going to do you any good.
You're in the war zone, you're a young photojournalist, and everything starts to go wrong. What do you do?
Keep calm. The worst possible scenario is to panic and do something stupid. I'm of the opinion that if you don't know what to do, don't do anything. Just stay where you are, try to keep safe, try to get shelter or cover, try to make sure that you've got enough water and food. Don't rush. People who get themselves into trouble are the people who make rash decisions. God, I'm being fired from all sides. I am in a small city in Syria where government forces are attacking from all sides. What do? I have to escape. You take the road, either by walking or by driving, and you get yourself into trouble. The first thing you do is try to assess the situation in a very reasoned way. People are, ordinary people are in a position to do that, but don't do things at the spur of the moment. That's the worst possible scenario. So if you can just take a deep breath, hide with a family who are sympathetic to you, or if you're on your own, try to take cover, make sure you've got enough water, and don't rush it. Communications is the second most important thing. The first one is to keep safe, try to keep safe somehow. A second one is to have an open line with the rest of the world. Even if you have to call somebody in London, if your mobile phone is working, or if you can pass messages through the local population to somebody, you've got to have an open channel of communication with the rest of the world. If you don't, and I can understand there might be situations when you don't, then don't panic. If you panic and start doing reckless things, you're more likely to get into trouble than if you try to keep calm and take some time to assess the situation.
Talk to me about psychological preparedness.
Well, I'm glad you asked this question. I think that this is one of the most important preparations if you decide to take a career in war reporting. Because even if you think of yourself as very tough, things that happened on the ground in a war zone can have a profound impact on you. Not just by being fired upon or finding yourself being chased by unfriendly people who try to kill you. In those situations, you probably don't think about what damage it does to you, to your psychological state. The adrenaline rush is such that it just blocks out everything else, and in my experience you don't really have traumatic memories because it's the excitement that takes over everything else. But there are situations when you see dead bodies. A young journalist will probably see a dead person for the first time in their life if they go into a war zone. You see bodies of dead children. People might die in your arms. Friends or strangers might. For me, the biggest experience of the Iraq War was not the trauma of people around me getting killed, or one of the producers who worked for us got blown up by a landmine. His leg had to be amputated. His cameraman got killed. His body was cut in half by a landmine. I didn't see that. For me, that was just a report that you can read in the newspapers or hear on the radio, because television don't normally show these pictures. But the people who saw these things had been traumatized for life. How do you deal with a situation when your cameraman lies dead on the ground with his body cut in half by a landmine? You've got to deal with the situation. People then somehow managed to get the two bits of the body into the back of the car and took it back to the nearest big population center, where the body was taken into a morgue and all that. For me, personally, the biggest traumatic experience in my work in war zones when our translator in Iraq, who got severely injured in the friendly fire incident, had his leg cut off by shrapnel. He was still alive. He was being brought back to the ambulances which I managed to secure to take our injured people. As he was transferred from the back of a Kurdish pickup truck, I held him in my arms for a brief period of time. I don't know how long. It can't have been longer than a minute, to take him into the ambulance, and he died. I just put him on the stretcher and said to the American paramedic, please make sure he gets the same treatment as any of us would. He said to me, I'm sorry, he didn't make it. Didn't realize he had died in my arms. He died because he bled to death of this severe injury. And years after that, I had this recurrent dream of Cameron dying in my arms. It was far more traumatic than seeing whole villages being obliterated by bombing and all that, because it's all very abstract. The immediacy of somebody dying in your arms is far more traumatic. That's something which is much more violent. It results in the death of many more people, and you've got to deal with it. And lots of people who end up coming back from war zones with big traumas, they don't want to go back. And this is what you've got to decide as a young, aspiring war reporter or photojournalist. You've got to be prepared to deal with very difficult situations when people will die next to you, and how do you deal with it?
Oggy Boytchev, thanks so much for talking to us today.